Okay, this is going to be a brief look at the history of the HIV-AIDS epidemic. So prehistory and what they call the silent spread probably started in Central Africa in the early 20th century through zoonotic transfer. But by the 1970s, they estimate that it was probably in places like New York and San Francisco. And spreading among the people there, particularly the gay communities. And this period, it was basically invisible from sight because the way that you identify it is that people are getting sick from opportunistic diseases. And so there was no reason to think that there was anything more than that going on to start with. 1981 is when people really become aware of it. And they initially call it the gay plague or GRID, gay-related immune deficiency. So it's from the very beginning is identified with homosexuality. And in fact, there's this phrase that goes the 4-H Club, which homosexuals, heroin users, hemophiliacs, and Haitians. So basically, it's pretty clearly stigmatized. It also means that people who are not one of those groups feel pretty comfortable and that they don't have to worry about it. And actually, in fact, for a lot of black men, they assume that this is really a problem of white gay men. It's not something that they need to worry about. Even though this disease is going on, the Reagan administration is very reluctant to do anything about it. President Ronald Reagan did not publicly mention the word AIDS until 1985, by which time thousands had already died. And of course, this coincides with the rise of the moral majority, the new right. And so figures like Jerry Falwell basically argued that this disease was divine retribution, punishing sinful people for their behavior. And so it became weaponizing a public health crisis as a way to try to roll back and get rid of the sexual revolution that had been taking place. It also is a sign that the people who were getting AIDS were seen as people who were not of high value, people who were not looked up to, people who were gay, people who were sex workers, people who were drug users were seen as not worthwhile people. And so there wasn't a sense of urgency about the epidemic. There was a major shift in the way that citizens interacted with medicine because of the AIDS epidemic. And we can sort of see this through ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, which was founded in 1987. And initially, it was a largely white movement, but there are, for example, later on, ACT UP in Philadelphia has a large black membership. But basically, they argue that silence equals death, that people need to talk about, they need to be public about what is happening and the losses that they're experiencing. Activists educated themselves about virology, about clinical trials, about all of these technical medical things so they could force the FDA to change how drugs were tested and approved. And in fact, they challenged the FDA. They challenged the medical establishment, demanding that queer people take part in the process of medical change. And then finally, you have this use of the physical reality of death as a site of protest. And so they had what they would call die-ins, where people would demonstratively die in public, not literally die, but act like they're dying as a way of forcing that on people's view. And then also, of course, the AIDS quilt, which was this huge quilt that is created with the names of all the people that people lost to AIDS. In some ways, it strengthened the LGBTQ community. In the absence of state aid, communities had to build their own infrastructure. So, for example, there's the gay men's health crisis to try to provide care for gay men that they desperately needed in this situation. At the same time, there's real struggles over inclusion. Black men, their advocates, for example, often challenge these organizations like the Gay Health Crisis, saying that they're not adequately serving men of color who usually lived in different neighborhoods, had different gathering places, that they had different community structures and cultural practices, and that they were not being included, not being cared for, not being given the resources that were going to the white community. By the 1990s, increasingly, there's a move for gay leadership away from radical liberation to a focus on healthcare, worry about inheritance rights, legal protections. Some people argue that this is the rise of a more respectable movement. Black communities in the 1980s and 1990s were facing a triple threat. They were threatened by the virus, they were threatened by the stigma of homosexuality, and there was also the crushing crack cocaine epidemic and mass incarceration. So all of these problems are hitting at one time, and all of them get entangled with the AIDS epidemic. Part of the problem is respectability politics. I know we've talked about this off and on multiple times, but a lot of traditional civil rights organizations were reluctant to get involved because they see this as presenting a disreputable view of Black people in public. Now that changes over time, and so organizations like the NAACP eventually do get involved, but at least initially there's a real reluctance to face up to this. Many Black churches initially, even though they were really the backbone of civil rights activism, really had a hard time trying to figure out how to reconcile this horrible epidemic and what it was doing with people with conservative theology about homosexuality. And so that resulted in a great deal of silence on the subject. That made it hard to get the kind of compassionate care that people needed. And there was this panic in the late 90s and early 2000s where the media becomes obsessed with the topic of Black men being on the down low and really sort of pathologize the idea of Black male sexuality, blaming them for being responsible for Black women and children for becoming infected, rather than looking at sort of the bigger issues and structural inequalities in society, like the lack of healthcare access, like the incarceral state, all of those issues. There's this great phrase, Black men loving Black men is a revolutionary act. There is a great deal of activism that develops out of the Black community itself. Black men join organizations, including the primarily white organizations like ACT UP, but often, as I mentioned, there's tensions there about allocation of resources, about a lack of representation, about the methods of outreach that are being used. And Black people create their own organizations. There's a whole number of them. One of them is the National Black Women's Health Project, which we talked about before. But one of the things that they get involved with is looking at the way that Black women are an important part of the epidemic and need to have the resources and care and help that they need. But there's a lot of other groups as well. I'm not going to try to list them all. And then outreach. There's a lot of debates over what's the best way to reach Black gay men. Do you go to the Black community as a whole and basically assume that way you're going to get everybody? Or do you try to work with other gay communities of color? Because this isn't just an issue for Black people. It's an issue for Latinos. It's an issue for American Indians. It's an issue for a lot of groups. It's also, do you specifically try to go to and find Black gay spaces and target those? It's also a question of what kind of outreach do you need? What is going to be relevant to the people who are risking infection? And sometimes what you're going to have to do is do things that the public health establishment may find disreputable or not acceptable, like role playing and other kinds of activities that allow people to talk, to deal with the realities of their life as sexual beings, and hopefully get educated about the choices that they have. There's also coming out of this really intense, what is sort of called the Black queer renaissance of cultural resistance in the late 80s and 90s. And it's a way of sort of saying we're facing this horrible level of destruction. Let's make ourselves be visible. Let's preserve who we are for the future. And it's sort of interesting to me that a lot of this was Black gay men, but they found a lot of inspiration in third world lesbian feminists. This is a time period where people would often call themselves third world when there were people of color. Women like Audre Lorde, others, and sort of look at inspiration at their own cultural resistance and drew on that in developing their own. Writers like Asa Hemphill, Joseph Bream, filmmakers like Marlon Riggs, his Tongues Untied, which used poetry and performance. And Tongues Untied becomes a big deal because it's actually got some funding from the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts. And that becomes hugely controversial, especially when it's played on PBS and a number of stations refuse to actually broadcast it and show it to the public. The thing is, 1996 is when things really divide. It's the great bifurcation. Because they develop HAART in 1996, highly active antiretroviral therapy. In other words, if you take the right medications, you can transform your chances of living and your chances of infection. And so what this means for wealthy white men, they have much greater chances of living full lives because they have access to insurance and because they can have access to the expensive drug cocktails that are basically what keeps people alive. It also reduces their risk of infecting people because you become less infectious as you take these drugs at the recommended levels. On the other hand, due to the lack of Medicaid expansion in the South, the lack of insurance, all of these things, marginalized communities, Black communities, do not have that same access. And AIDS remains a leading cause of death. And just look at that demographic. The estimated lifetime risk of HIV for white gay men in 2016 is 1 in 11, Latino gay men 1 in 4, Black gay men 1 in 2. And that's particularly true in the South. So what happens is the geography of the epidemic really shifts. We go from having this focus on urban centers like New York and San Francisco to having it centered in rural places in the South, in many cases, in the deep South. Part of the thing is a reverse migration. People who had gone north or gone west to the cities came back home to the South for family support as they became ill. But the thing is they're moving into areas that just do not have specialized medical care and do not have access to a lot of health care in general, that are in fact in many cases healthcare deserts. The virus traveled along trucking routes and migrant labor paths, once again hitting southern towns that really do not have healthcare resources. And finally, of course, incarcerated Black men are often exposed to HIV in incarcerated environments where you don't have access to protection, you don't have access to condoms, you don't have access to medication. And so they often return home with high loads of virus and no access to medication. And the problem is, this goes with basically an abandonment of the kinds of choices that need to be made to deal with this public health crisis. One of the major aspects of it is when there is an opportunity to expand Medicaid, which would make healthcare available to a lot of people in the Deep South, the government refuses to do so in a number of states. And what that means is that they do not have access to the drugs, the heart medications that would preserve people's lives unless they qualify for emergency services. And by the time they have to get emergency services, that's really too late to have the extension of their lifetime that they could have had if they received it as an earlier point. In addition to that, a lot of rural hospitals, because of the lack of Medicaid funding, have closed, increasing the lack of medical opportunities that are available for people. In addition to that, there are very seldom HIV specialists in rural southern areas. It may take 3 to 5 hours to transport yourself from rural Mississippi or rural Alabama to some place where there's an HIV specialist. And of course, there's not any kind of public transportation for the most part, or very limited. In addition to that, where telehealth might make an option available that you could get access to health care and advice that way, in a lot of these areas, they don't have reliable high-speed internet, which means that telehealth really can't work. Plus, there's the issue of criminalization. They passed a lot of laws in the 1980s and 1990s when they really didn't understand HIV and how it worked. And 32 states still have HIV-specific criminal laws or sentence enhancements. And so you can get arrested for things like not telling a partner that you have HIV, even if you're doing the right things and you're not dangerous. If you spit on people, like when you're being arrested and you have HIV, that could be an additional charge against you, even though it's established that saliva will not transmit the disease. There's other kinds of sentencing enhancements. And then in addition to that, there's the problem of access to PrEP. Pre-exposure prophylaxis. Basically, it's something that you can take so you can safely have sex and not have to worry about the HIV status of your partner. It's basically a miracle drug, but just for all those reasons we talked about, not having access to heart, same problems means that people don't have access to PrEP. The Black church in the South is an important institution, but it also continues to be somewhat problematic in its response to AIDS. You had this problem of respectability, which made people reluctant to discuss the issue of it, as well as concern about homosexuality as a sin. There's also concern about maintaining the respectability of the church, the respectability of Black people in general. Now, that is not necessarily the case today. That has changed over time in some churches, but that was a long-standing issue. And then when the churches did respond, they often tended to frame it as HIV being a test of faith or a social ill or something to be pitied rather than an injustice to be fought, not seeing it necessarily through a civil rights lens. And then finally, there is the other side of it, which is what one thing I read called kitchen table ministries, but basically Black women in churches in particular who basically bypass the deacons to provide care, housing, food, helping those people who are dying of the disease and helping them find the resources that they need. So the church is both incredibly important, but and also in some ways problematic. Despite all of this, you do have networks of Southern grassroots resistance. There's organizations like Sister Love, started in 1989, which turns their ideas of reproductive justice, remember when we were talking about that, they turn it as well to thinking about HIV and dealing with the care that's needed for HIV. There's other organizations as well. There's the Southern States Manifesto, which was drafted in 2001, that basically says that instead of just looking at a rights-based approach, we need to go to a justice-based approach. That having a right to treatment doesn't mean anything if we don't have the resources and the infrastructure that makes it possible for people to access that. So there is hope.